Last time we talked about the 1704 Battle of Orford Ness and Gustav Selander's decision to honor his king's orders and take battle with a single ship of the line, outnumbered 54 cannons to the English fleet's 9 warships and 446 cannons. We will now jump forward about 250 years in time. It is now 1939, and the Second World War is a fact. In a speech in August of that year, Prime Minister Per Albin Hansson utters the since much discussed phrase "Vår beredskap är god", which roughly translates to "Our readiness is good". But whatever the Prime Minister might have referred to, the fact is that the military readiness at the time was not good or adequate for the situation. Just a couple of months later, Finland will be invaded by the Soviets, and even if Sweden did not join the war on Finland's side, a large portion of the little defense equipment that were available were given to the Finns. And in April of the next year, both Denmark and Norway will be invaded by the Germans, making Sweden surrounded, and in its worst strategic situation since 1808. During the 1930s, the debate had been heavy in Sweden about how to deal with military matters and raise military readiness. That debate tilted heavily towards army matters, which many Navy officers naturally disagreed with. One of the naval officers leading the campaign to get more resources for the Navy was Torsten Hagman. Hagman had joined the Navy as a cadet already as a 14-year-old, and had since, during his career, went on to command several different types of ships, and at one point had been an adjutant to the then Minister of Defense, Per Albin Hansson, the same man who would later become Prime Minister for the whole of the war period. The two had bonded and became friends and socialized in their spare time. Hagman had also been the leading voice for creating the first press department in the Navy and led it as its first commander. A department he argued would better help to bring the Navy's message to the population. With the Second World War now a fact, Sweden looked outwards for somewhere to quickly acquire material for the armed forces. At the same time, Italy needed foreign currency and was looking to enhance its reputation after the Second Italo-Abyssinian War. With Italy not yet officially in the war on Germany's side, Sweden now managed to negotiate the purchase of 4 torpedo boats, 216 planes and 4 destroyers and various other defense material. The man who got the commission to go to Italy and lead a project of taking the material home was Torsten Hagman. In January 1940, the deal was signed for the ships, and Hagman arrived at the end of the same month to start the work on getting the ships home. On the 30th of March, Hagman received his orders from the Chief of the Navy for the journey home. These orders included one paragraph which would later become much discussed and vital for what were to happen. The paragraph in Hagman's orders went as follows: "I expect that, in other respects, in face of situations that may arise, you will carry out your mission in a manner that upholds the reputation and honor of the Swedish Navy." Hagman had then himself, in his orders to his subordinate ship commanders, developed that order further and defined it to mean: "If it comes to battle, the destroyers shall engage offensively without regard to their own losses. No ship may be surrendered. It must be scuttled by its own crew, if it can no longer be defended." On the 14th of April 1940, the 4 destroyers and the follow-along passenger ferry Patricia set sail for home. The destroyers, now in Swedish service, had gotten their new names. The first 2 were named Romulus and Remus in homage to Italy, while the second pair got the names for 2 Swedish legendary naval commanders. The first ship was named Puke, after Admiral Johan of Puke, who had most famously led the very difficult escape of the locked-in Swedish Navy at the 1790 Battle of Viborg Bay. His conversation with King Gustav III before the battle gives an echo to his character. The king says to Puke, "Dear Puke, you are the leader of my fleet. Your father did not refuse to risk his head for my father, so do not spare your life or courage for me. I shall not forget it." To this, Puke replied, "Yes, your majesty, I will then well go out, but as for how the others will fare, we shall see." Well, more than 10 ships and thousands of men were lost that day, but the Swedish Navy escaped, and then went on to end the war by winning the arguably greatest victory in its history at the Battle of Svinesund. But, back to 1940 again. We now have the name of one ship. So what might trump that name? Well, the second ship was named Psilander, after, yes, that is right, Gustav Psilander, who chose to rather fight till the end than surrender. All this was history that Torsten Hagman was very familiar with, and that was absolutely on his mind as he led his fleet north. On the 19th of June, the Swedish fleet arrived at the Faroe Islands for provisioning. A calm and well-needed stop for the fleet, but the calm would not persist. Early in the morning of the next day, a small boat carrying the British captain Clifford Colson, commander of a nearby squadron of tribal-class destroyers, approached Hagman on Puke. Colson explained that the British government demanded that the ships were to be surrendered, and that the Swedish crews had to be gone before midday. Hagman was now in a very difficult situation. He knew the British squadron was much superior in firepower to the Swedish, and that the battle could only end in one way. In the book Klart skepp, Svenska flottan i krig och fred under 500 år, about the history of the Swedish Navy, Rear Admiral Thomas Engvall gives a positive review on Hagman's life, and in my opinion, by talking about how his colleagues viewed him afterwards, describes well the choice Hagman now faced. Engvall writes, "In the case of Torsten Hagman, this is especially striking, and after the so-called destroyer affair with the Italian destroyers, which is described later in this text, he came to be viewed by his contemporaries in two ways. Either as an officer who made a difficult decision that went against given orders by refraining from engaging the British. Thanks to this, the primary mission of bringing the destroyers to Sweden was accomplished, and there was no risk of Sweden being drawn into the war on the German side due to this incident. Or B, as an officer who disobeyed orders and failed to uphold the honor of the Swedish Navy and the nation by surrendering the ships without a fight. The signals this sent to the warring parties were that Sweden and the Swedes were not prepared to fight, which in itself could increase the risk of war and result in much greater losses in terms of values than the lives and the property represented by the destroyers and the support ships with their crews." Hagmans analysis of the situation is recounted in the book Sjömakt och sjöfolk, den svenska flottan under 500 år. The book explains, Hagman consulted with his ship commanders. Fighting their way out was unthinkable. The fuel would only last a short distance, and then everything would be over. A battle inside the fjord was, if possible, even more hopeless. Only the two aft 10cm guns on Romulus were facing the British, while they were up against 24 12cm guns. On top of that, there were British aircraft, coastal artillery and ground troops. To say that the battle would result in a massacre was almost an understatement. Furthermore, there were all the civilians on board of Patricia to consider. Hagman and his destroyer commanders were in complete agreement. It was a matter of saving lives. In other words, Hagman could either do a Puke and break out, a Psilander and stand and fight, or maybe there was a third option. The action Hagman ultimately decided on was to give up the destroyers, but demand to take sail with the support ships. This was agreed upon by the British, and by doing this Hagman could quickly get into a position to radio home to Sweden. This set off urgent diplomatic activity between the two governments, which led to the British releasing the ships quickly and them being able to dock in Gothenburg already on the 10th of July. Back home, Hagman was met coldly by many of his contemporaries, and even his friend, the Prime Minister, refused to meet him upon the ship's homecoming. The symbolism of him refusing to give battle while leading a flotilla with both Puke and Psilander in it was striking. Instead, Hagman was court-martialed for refusing to obey an order. Strangely, this court proceeding never came to any conclusion. It instead ended without reaching either a guilty or a non-guilty verdict. A fact that continued to bother Hagman for the rest of his life, although later in life he did get a personal thanks from the king, which helped somewhat to settle the issue for him.